And so let's talk about grass-fed, grain-fed. My listeners hear me talk about, hey, like it's one of the big changes that I recommend people make is move away from conventional animal products and move towards grass-fed, pasture-raised animal products. And so what is going on in conventional farming? Like what kinds of things are being done versus grass-fed? And let's talk about kind of the nutritional differences between those.
Yeah. So first, when you go into a grocery store, 95% of those products are raised in confinement, right? I have a number of concerns with that, and we'll get to the human health ones. First is just, the humane treatment of animals.
Yeah.
Doesn't always happen there. I think we can all acknowledge that. The second is just the environmental concerns. Manure, like you were saying, 50% of the manure or fertilizer used worldwide is actually manure. And so in a well-managed system, this is a real asset. But when we raise animals in confinement and then there's just, thousands, tens of thousands of them together, their manure becomes overwhelming. It creates ammonia in the atmosphere, it pollutes our waterways, and on and on. And then also when we're feeding cows grain that's raised with fertilizer, again, this is creating runoff and problems in the environment and nitrous oxide release and on and on. So, and then we have additives. This is more pertinent to human health. We have things like ractopamine, which is a beta agonist that can be used in cows and pigs. And it's been linked to like heart palpitations in humans and poisonings. And it's not great for the animals either. They say it can make them aggressive. And then we have my major issue is antibiotics being used. 97, or 73% of antibiotics worldwide are actually used in animal agriculture. And they create antibiotic resistant bacteria. That's a looming threat. And a lot of people will tell you that there is a withdrawal period where animals can't be given antibiotics before they're used for food. And that's probably true. But I just read a study that showed even animals who were raised, going in for the certification as raised without antibiotics, I think it was 15% of them still had antibiotics in their urine. And there's a number of tricky labels we can get into this, but antibiotics are a concern. And then when it comes to just the nutritional differences, so it depends on the breed, right? Dairy and eggs seem to be very, very vulnerable, right? We see better levels of omega-3 fatty acids, a better fatty acid ratio, and sometimes higher levels of antioxidants like A and E. When it comes to pork, my favorite example of this is our regenerative pig farmer actually did a study because our omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio is thought to be a contributor to inflammation. And we all know nobody wants inflammation. And when you get a conventionally raised pork product, the ratio is about 35-1. And we want to opt for, 4-1, 1-1. That's an extreme example. Range. But yeah. And so what he did was see if I put my pigs on pasture for 50% of the time, and then for 100% of the time or 0% of the time, how did that change that ratio? And he actually got down when he gave the right breed of pigs all grass, it was down to a 5-1 ratio. So that's remarkable from a 35-1. And even just putting your grain-fed pigs on pasture brought that ratio down in half. So we know in pork, fatty acid ratio is hugely determined by what that animal is consuming. And then when it comes to beef, there's a lot of nuance in the discussion, of course, the breed of the cow, where you're raising it. But there are some pretty clear trends that fatty acid ratios, omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio improves when it's fed grass. There's more CLA, which is conjugated linoleic acid. That's a beneficial acid for anti-diabetes and anti-cancer properties. And then we have higher levels of glutathione, our body's master antioxidant. Some trials have shown higher levels of B vitamins, and some trials have actually shown that in feedlots too, because they give supplements. And the minerals is it depends on the trial. Again, it depends on probably where the animal's being raised and probably the conditions of the soil at the heart of it where the animal is being raised. But what's really exciting is there's levels of secondary compounds. And my friend, Dr. Provenza and Dr. Van Vliet have looked at, feedlot meat versus regeneratively raised meat. And these secondary compounds, which are not fat, carbohydrates, and protein, but they're things like terpenoids and carotenoids and phenols and these other compounds that we generally attribute to plant food, but we know have demonstrable benefits, at least in animal studies, anti-diabetic, anti-inflammatory, antifungal, and on and on. But those levels increase significantly the more diverse the pasture the animal is raised on. And that's what I'm really excited about, because now what they're looking at, and I'm actually doing my dissertation, and I think I'll be involved in some of this research, is what does it matter for human health that those levels of anti-inflammatory compounds increase? And Dr. Provenza is really interested in, they seem to promote satiety as well, which is another thing I think most Americans struggle with, is I think it has to do with, we don't eat a lot of protein, high quality food. We're just looking for these nutrients that might not even still be in most of the food we're eating. But he's going to do a study, actually, Dr. Van Vliet is, where he looks at CAFO meat, or confined animal feeding operation, versus regeneratively raised meat and plant-based burgers. And then what is the response after a meal in the inflammation? Yeah. And so they did a study in Australia, so where they kind of got a glimpse in this. Do you know about this study?
No.
Okay, so they took wild kangaroo meat, and then they took confined animal feeding meat, Wagyu beef specifically, and then they looked at, it was a crossover trial, so the same participants did both. And what they looked at was the levels of inflammation post meal, and did they change? And what they found is when you ate the kangaroo meat, the wild meat, it was a significantly less inflammation after response. But of course, it's not beef to beef. And so Van Vliet is going to come in and do that beef to beef comparison and try and demonstrate, his hypothesis is that the levels will be lower the more diverse the pasture. But the big thing is too, a lot of this research, when you hear grass-fed beef aren't that different, if you've ever heard that, it a lot of time comes down to the regulation. Like grass-fed can mean a lot of different things, and we can get into that too. But regeneratively raised beef, I think we're going to find really awesome things in terms of its human health potential.
Yeah, because it can be grass-fed, but then grain finished, right? The last 90 days to really fatten it up. And that's going to drain, the omega-3s are going to go down. Conjugated linoleic acid is going to go down. So it's not going to be looking super significantly different than, 100% grain-fed. So that's a big factor there. For me, it just comes down to the idea in nutrition that we want to maximize the amount of nutrients in our diet. We want to minimize the amount of toxins. And so whatever the animal eats, that's what's going to make up their flesh and their dairy products, right? Or their eggs or whatever it is. And so when an animal is eating conventionally grown, sprayed pesticide, herbicide sprayed grains we know have very little nutrition, and they have high omega-6 fats, right? High omega-6, very low omega-3s. And then they've got, glyphosate and different herbicides and pesticides. And so all of those toxins are going to bioaccumulate in the meat, in the dairy products of that animal. And they're basically fed like 24/7. I mean, they just have unlimited access. So these grains are higher glycemic than what the cows are supposed to eat. So they're developing insulin resistance, which shuts down their detoxification pathways. So they're bioaccumulating these toxins, and they have very little nutrients in them. Whereas when they're eating grass, the grass we know has got a lot of carotenoids, right? So we know that, if your grass, like out here in Georgia, we kind of have a little bit of a drought going on right now. And so people that don't have their sprinklers on, we're seeing the grass turn yellow. That's the carotenoids in there as the chlorophyll dies off. So we know grass has these carotenoids in it. We know that, just the green pastures, we got chlorophyll in there. We have got, that helps actually increase conjugated linoleic acid in the system. We have omega-3s in the grass. And then, like you mentioned, a lot of these kind of adaptogenic, like when I think about terpenes, I think about adaptogenic herbs, right? Because that's one of the major compounds that acts almost like a thermostat, right? Where it's kind of setting the temperature or helping adapt your body's energy levels, adapting your circadian rhythm by consuming. Like, for example, ashwagandha has lots of terpenes, rhodiola, right? Things like that we know for energy, for help, for sleep, for stress reduction. These compounds, they're in these adaptogens, particularly adaptogens that are grown in environments that are more biodiverse, right? And are in more geographically challenging environments. Like rhodiola is supposed to be grown, it grows in Siberia, and it faces extreme temperature changes, right? And so those terpenes help it adapt to that environment. And then when we consume it, we take on those, we confer those benefits, and it helps us adapt to the environment we're in. So when these cows are consuming these, they're taking on grass and, different green foods and whatnot that they're consuming, that is going through, is having to adapt to geographical changes, to a biodiverse environment. things like that. And so they're creating more of these powerful adaptogenic compounds. And now the cow's consuming that. Now their meat, their dairy products are going to have that in it. And so for the consumer, I mean, you think about it, it's like you are what you eat, right? We hear that term all the time. And then we are what we're eating when it comes to meat has eaten, right? And so
Yes.
that's what we have to think about.